Today I'm joined by Yaakov Katz, the former editor of the Jerusalem Post and a senior fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute, a think tank based in Jerusalem. Yaakov is the author of several books, including Shadow Strike, about the Israeli operation to destroy the Syrian nuclear program in 2007, Weapon Wizards, how Israel became a high-tech military superpower, and Israel versus Iran, which speaks for itself. So, Yaakov, thank you very much for joining us and welcome.
Thank you, Jake.
So just to clear something up, first of all, we're not actually related.
No. People have asked if we're brothers, but I think we're just descended from the same Ashkenazi Jew or Jews who weren't known for their hair, I guess. Yeah,
yeah, we're bald, bearded, and angry, which is a type. It's a type. I sort of think that we're a bit like Lior Raz in that.
Something. Well, yeah, he's a little more famous and successful, but it's all relative.
Also, we have the same name, so that would be weird if we were brothers. Anyway, let's talk about what we're here to talk about, which is America. So yesterday, President Biden signed an executive order against settler violence. Can you tell us exactly what that was and what it means?
The Biden administration for a long time has been speaking about settler violence. And I think we have to be honest and say clearly that there is an issue, right? For too long, there have been a group of extreme, mostly settlers, although we don't know. I think it's a problem to even use that term because it could be right-wing activists who come from even outside the West Bank. But if we roll with the term, we're talking about Jews who live primarily in the West Bank who are engaging in violent activity against Palestinian residents. Now, it could be an incident, for example, where Palestinians are trying to harvest their olive grove. And then we've all seen these videos of where masked settlers with bats or rocks come down a mountain from the settlement that's up on top and start fighting with them. Then occasionally there's a shooting incident. And then comes the question, what happened, right? Why did someone get shot?
Can you just talk about what's happened since October the 7th? Because that's been that was a moment where suddenly it became much more intense.
100%. So, I mean, but I just think the context is important because it's something that's been on the radar of the administration for a long time. And the Democrats have been talking about it since October 7th, while everyone's eyes have been on the South and Gaza and a bit to the north with Hezbollah. There has been a major increase in violence, mostly coming from Palestinians towards Israelis, but also there have been clashes between settlers and Palestinians. And the administration, often you'll hear it from Secretary Blinken or even President Biden and others who, when they're voicing support for Israel and saying Israel should defend itself and we support Israel's right? Let's keep in mind the Biden administration has not called for a ceasefire in Gaza. But at the same time, and the other side of the mouth, they'll say we also need to see a crackdown and more action taken against settler violence. And what happened?
What sort of numbers are we talking about? Just give us a sense of the scale of how many people, how many incidents, how many deaths, that sort of feel. Yeah.
So it's tough to exactly put your finger on what the numbers are. We know of dozens, if not hundreds, of incidents. Now, what is the definition of an incident? It could be, like I referred before, clashes at an olive grove. What that is, we don't exactly know. And I've long been critical of the IDF and the police for not doing enough to crack down and stop that. There are a number of Palestinians who have been killed. I think it's about 10 at this point. And they are not necessarily in the last few months, in the last year. And who exactly killed them, what the circumstances were for them being killed, these are things that are being investigated. One of the people, for example, who is apparently sanctioned by the Americans at the moment is a known right-wing extremist who's actually sitting, as we speak, in administrative detention in an Israeli prison. So it's not as if the Israeli judicial system is not working, right? You could say it's not hard enough, it's not aggressive enough, but there is a rule of law in this country. We could be critical of it, but it does exist.
Is 10 really the right number? Because if you look online, you'll find reports about hundreds of Palestinians being shot by Israeli radical settlers, whatever you want to call them, since October the 7th. Is the true number really 10?
No. Hundreds. There have been hundreds of Palestinians who've been killed over the last year by Israeli security forces. For example, we saw just this past week that amazing video of the Israeli commandos disguised as Palestinians going into that Jenin hospital, and where this part we didn't see on video, but where they eliminated 3, what Israel says were Hamas operatives in the midst of planning an October 7th style attack. So those are, for the most part, 90+%, if not more, 99% probably, are killed, at least according to Israel, legitimately because these are terrorists. Occasionally, there are also civilians caught in the crossfire. But the number of incidents where some radical extremist Jew picks up an M16 and opens fire callously at some random Palestinian, these are far and few, rarely happen. It's nothing of a phenomenon that I think we need to talk about, to the level, at least, that the Biden administration needs to issue an executive order and start to sanction people.
Right.
That's pretty extreme.
And that's a really important distinction, isn't it? Because numbers, hundreds and hundreds are bandied around online, but it's a way of merging clashes with Israel's armed forces with terrorist elements and extremist activity, and making out as if they're all one and the same thing.
Well, I mean, that's exactly my problem with this. I have no tolerance for any of this violence. However, my problem is with the moral equivalency that is trying to be created here between Hamas, a state-sponsored and a state actor, which is basically a systematic organization of terrorism with tens of thousands of fighters, tens of thousands of rockets, hundreds of kilometers of tunnels, use of human shields, massive massacre of Jews and Israelis. To say that and then talk about a small, tiny fringe group of people who occasionally take the law into their own hands, it's almost as if, Jake, I would say that because Chicago, where I'm from, is like the murder capital of America, that all of Americans are murderers. I mean, come on, it's disingenuous at the best, and it's actually, I think what it really does is it emboldens terrorism to an extent, and I think it shows moral confusion by the Biden administration, because again, I want to say or repeat for the 10th time, I have zero tolerance for this, but we're in a war, which is a clash of civilizations.
Right.
And to say the two things at the same time makes it seem like both sides are to blame. And I don't think that's the case.
So let's just back up and drill down into that idea. So what your contention is that the Biden administration is somehow seeking to sanction these radicals, let's call them radicals, as part of a balancing act with its stance on Hamas. Why do you think that that's the case?
Well, I think that the Biden administration, and let me just say it at the top of this answer, that they've been remarkable when it comes to the war with that Israel's been waging against Hamas. The fact that we're 120 plus days into this and Biden has yet to call for a comprehensive ceasefire, the support, the continued delivery and supply of weapons and spare parts for Israel, this is all of critical importance, and the diplomatic cover. But I think that Biden, who's now, as we know, engaged in a political battle with what's likely to be Donald Trump as his contender, he needs to start to break a little more to the left. He took a sharp turn towards Israel, but now he needs to try to show some daylight and distance as the elections move into high gear. And let's talk about just yesterday, right? The president issues this executive order as he's flying to Michigan. Now, why is Michigan interesting? Because Michigan is, an area near Detroit called Dearborn, which is home to the most Arabs and Muslims inside the United States. Now, they are obviously very upset with the president and the position that he's taken on the war against Hamas and Israel. And there's the really tragic death toll that we're seeing coming out of Gaza. And there is a tragedy unfolding in Gaza for the Palestinian people. We can recognize that. I would say it's Hamas to blame, but put that aside for a moment. He's under a lot of pressure. Michigan, if he loses Michigan, not because these Arabs will vote, these Arab Americans will vote for Trump, but they just might stay home. That would give the state to Trump, and that could give Trump the victory in the election this coming November. Right. So he has what to be concerned about.
Right. Although, as Dan Senor has pointed out a few times, the Arab vote in Michigan, I believe, is only a swing of about 1%. So if he's relying upon that 1%, then he's in more serious hot water than he needs to be in.
This is true. However, in these swing states, we've seen, I mean, let's not go too far back in time, but to 2000 when it was the Bush-Gore election, right? And look what happened in Florida. It was a handful of votes that determined that election. This is going to be a tough election for President Biden. And it's not just the Arab Americans in Michigan and Dearborn. It's progressives, it's young people, it is the liberal, the more far left Democrats. He has to start to break a little more to the left. And I think this is the beginning of what we're seeing. But it's also, there's something a little deeper here, Jake. And that is the frustration with Netanyahu. They are frustrated in Washington with Netanyahu, who they feel is not getting on board for the day after plan that they would like to see occur here, which would see a revitalized, emboldened Palestinian Authority, a move towards normalization with the Saudis, a stable and secure Gaza with some sort of multinational force maybe in reconstruction, but more importantly for the Americans, a move and a road at least towards a vision of a two-state solution.
Right.
Prime Minister Netanyahu won't talk about that.
Well, let's talk about all of that in a moment. But first of all, let's just focus on the domestic American politics, just to finish that section, because it really matters, doesn't it? It feels to me like Biden is trying to really unify his party. I mean, he's, the American people are, broadly speaking, polls have shown on the side of Israel by some margin or across the board. And yet within his party, members of his party and parliamentarians, there's a split, isn't there? And so you think that this move of the executive order is a way of trying to get the left wing of his party more into the tent, so there's a unified party going into the election.
In the big picture, 100%, right? He needs to get the more progressive part and flank of the Democrats back on board and back with him. It's not just obviously the Arab Americans in Michigan, but I mean, keep in mind, there are polls that are showing that Trump is up 5 points in Michigan alone. And that is something that is going to be very crucial for the president to try to narrow that gap as we move closer to November. But he's got a lot of problems within his own party. Senators, we've seen letters that have been written just in the last few weeks of senators who are calling to reevaluate the support and aid, military aid to Israel. So this is something that's really, he wants to see this wind down. He wants to be able to move beyond it. And he wants to show that he has some credit for actually cracking the whip on Israel a bit. This, I guess, in their mind, is a way to do that without undermining the war effort to an extent, right?
Keep
giving really Israel what it needs to fight Hamas.
It doesn't really mean anything because these guys aren't going to come to America anyway. One of them at least is in prison already. It's a symbolic gesture to placate the left of his party. And of course, there was a significant vote, wasn't there, yesterday, where 2 members of his party voted the wrong way.
Yeah, so I mean, look, again, there is a lot of discontent within his party. There are people who are not happy at all. And it's not just the Bernie Sanders types. I mean, we've seen other more mainstream senators, Chris Murphy from Connecticut and others who are really calling to reevaluate what's going on here, right? They are all in an election season. Remember that in America, when you come a presidential election, which is held every 4 years, so that's again, it's an election for the House of Representatives, so for congressmen. It's an election for some of the Senate, right? Because that's elections that are held every 6 years. Some of those senators are up for re-election. They really are all feeling a bit of pressure right now, especially if you're coming from a district where you have a significant Democratic majority or a liberal progressive contingent that you have to make sure that they will vote for you. And this is something that's going to accompany us, I would say, for a while. And by the way, just on that point, I think that's another reason why the clock is ticking for Israel. We don't have indefinite amount of time for the high intensity stage of this conflict.
Right. Well, let's swing things back to Israel then. I mean, how do you think this move of the executive order was taken by the Netanyahu administration? Do you think that they felt that it was a breaking of a fragmenting of support for Israel in any way, or do they see it purely as a domestic issue?
Look, there's 2 ways to look at it. On the one hand, you could say, like we were just saying, this is a cracking of the whip. It's sending a message. And you could even look at it positively to some extent, right? By saying, okay, they're not denying us spare parts. They're not stopping the delivery of weapons. They're doing this to send a message that they're upset with us. let's be thankful that it's this and not something else that we really need at the moment. On the other hand, you could say we're in for some trouble, right? And this is maybe what that represents. And Israel, which might itself be entering an election season when this war winds down a bit more, and who knows what's going to happen here politically, this is going to be one of those issues. Netanyahu is quiet, hasn't said a word since yesterday when that executive order came out. The people who did speak up were, of course, the more right-wing people, like Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, the head of the religious Zionist party, who already is a persona non grata in Washington and in the United States. And he slammed back really hard at Biden, but he doesn't care. He's not looking to work with Biden. He's not looking to go to America. And his constituents are those settlers there, and his voters are the settlers themselves. So he of course, has to pay lip service to them and be their ultimate defender.
Right. So let's talk about Netanyahu and the day after. We've had a couple of headlines over the past few days that I think took people by surprise in Britain and in the States. David Cameron, Lord Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, said at a dinner that the UK would consider a unilateral recognition of the Palestinian state. And there are reports that Congress or the American administration is considering doing the same. So it does seem as if there's a sort of pincer movement of saber rattling coming from Britain and the States in this regard. What does all this mean with regard to the day after in Israel?
You know, I think that Israel is making a crucial mistake, and I think our leadership is making a mistake by not outlining what the day after looks like, right? There's a lot of vague descriptions of what Israel wants to see, the elimination of Hamas, a new security reality. Okay, but how does that practically happen? And what the Americans, and I think also the British, talk about, and our other allies around the world, is we need to get back on a track for a two-state solution. Now, personally, I think, yes, ultimately we have to find a way to disengage and separate from the Palestinians. That will ultimately, hopefully, culminate in a Palestinian state. I don't think it's possible in the years to come, but it is something that we should all be working towards, and it's something that we should say that is the objective, that is the declared goal. The fact that Israeli leaders are not able to say any of that, on the contrary, they're saying we're not going to have any of that, creates a lot of frustration, I think, among our allies who have been very supportive. You know, you and I were both just about a week and a half ago at the Conservative Friends for Israel luncheon, where you had 20 cabinet ministers. You had the prime minister, David Cameron, was also there. And you listened to Rishi Sunak's speech, and really remarkable, what a stand by the side of Israel. But I think that we can't take that for granted. They expect to see a quid pro quo in the sense that Israel is going to move in the direction that they anticipate should be the right one. Netanyahu can't do that, though, because of his political constraints, right? Because, again, if Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and others who will bolt his coalition the second he would endorse a two-state solution, that's what we're dealing with.
Right. So in a way, Netanyahu is in a bind, because if his right-wing supporters in cabinet leave, he's sunk. And so he has no political bandwidth to accept the package that the West and the Saudis are trying to impose upon Israel.
Correct. I mean, you know, you would expect that in a time of war like the one that we're fighting, which I think we all agree. And even people who are not the biggest supporters of Israel understand after October 7th that this is not sustainable and something does need to change. The prime minister and the cabinet should be doing what's right for the country, not what's right for their political survival. Right. And unfortunately, we are in a bind of biblical proportions for the prime minister, who is on trial. His trial is continuing all this week. There were hearings about his criminal trial. Remember, he's on trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. He's got the prospect of jail hovering over his head. He's got the prospect of losing his coalition, and he believes deeply that he has to stay in power to defeat the trial. So he needs to stay as prime minister for his own survival. But at the same time, that clashes with what's right for the country. And this is a massive handicap that the Israeli people are carrying with them throughout this period.
Right. But let's just unpick a few sort of areas that have been a little bit confused in the past few days. So one is that Netanyahu said he wouldn't accept a two-state solution, but there was a sense in which he was finding a narrow opening where he said that he wouldn't accept a Palestinian state because that would mean that it would be a military state, and that would compromise Israel's security. So there was a little window of saying, well, if there was a demilitarized state, then I might accept it. He didn't say that, but there was that opening, wasn't there?
I'll go even further. He in other speeches and other statements he's made, he said, how could I accept the Palestinian Authority to take over the West Bank when they incite in their education system, when they have to pay for slavery, right? They have laws that pay terrorists to murder Jews, when they have corruption in their institutions. So you could read that as a naysayer, or you could read it as he's actually outlining the path to allow the Palestinian Authority to enter into Gaza. What I would have liked to see, though, based on what you're saying and what I'm saying, is no problem. Outline that path for us. Explain, talk in the positive. Say, I understand that the Palestinian Authority is the best partner and is the future for possible stability, because there's just no one else, right? The Saudis aren't lining up to enter into Gaza and to rule 2.2 million Palestinians. So what we need to happen is for there to be the Palestinian Authority, but we need a Palestinian Authority that's not corrupt, that doesn't pay terrorists, that doesn't incite in their education system, that has new leadership. Why not speak that way? Say, if that happens, then I'd be happy for them to come in and to take over the Gaza Strip.
Right, and the package that's being put forward by the Saudis and the international community is not a Palestinian state; it's a pathway to a Palestinian state, right? I mean, it's a commitment that that's the direction of travel. And so we could, and the prize for that would be Israeli normalization with Saudi Arabia, which would be a pretty significant achievement. And so if there is this future whereby you've got a Palestinian state that's demilitarized, that isn't a threat, next to Israel, with Saudi normalization and everything that would bring around the region, that obviously would be a good, and with Hamas out of power and dealt with in Gaza, that looks like the end of the Israeli-Arab and even the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right?
Halavai, as we say in Hebrew, right? I wish, definitely the Saudi normalization is like the cherry that's being dangled in our front of our eyes for us to see that we should be embracing this plan that's been presented by the Americans and others. So we understand that there's a huge benefit at the end of the tunnel. I agree that this overarching plan is the right move. The question, though, the problem's in the details, right? And can we effectively remove Hamas from power? By the way, it ties back to what we spoke about before. Why has Biden not called for a ceasefire? Because he understands also that if he wants this larger plan to take root, he needs for Israel to eliminate the Hamas leadership. Because if Hamas is still in charge of Gaza, forget about it. None of this is going to happen. So it's all interconnected. And that's why, again, you would want to have everybody on the same page and working towards the same goal. Right. I think almost, Jake, that Israel, because of the nature of the October 7th attacks, we really have sympathy and solidarity in a way that we didn't have before from large parts of the international community. We should be leveraging that in a way to achieve things that we weren't able in the past. But the politics in Israel are getting in the way, and that is wrong. That shouldn't be happening.
Right. But even that aside, there are other obstacles in this pathway to the two-state solution that the international community is favoring. I mean, there are the old obstacles, right? There's what do you do with the settlements? What do you do with Jerusalem? Do you divide it? Do you keep it united? What do you do with the old city? What do you do with Palestinian quote unquote refugees? There's all that stuff that we all know about.
Right.
But then there's also this idea, which isn't new, but it's suddenly got new focus, which is that the Palestinians have been gripped in a to some greater or lesser extent in the bloodlust of extremism since before the foundation of Israel, since the 1920s and even before that. And they've never really managed to convincingly, properly, wholeheartedly recognize the right of Jews to live in that land. And from there comes pay to slay. From there comes Hamas, actually. From there comes the PLO approach of trying to get the Jews out of Israel by a death by 1,000 cuts approach of terrorism. And that is not a small thing. And it means that there isn't really any Palestinian leader or selection of leaders who you could turn to say, get rid of this stuff, because they're all tinged with it.
You know, it's what you said is 100% true and accurate, and it's such a unfortunate reality because things could be so different if there was the right leadership, if there was the right culture and the right society on the other side. Unfortunately,
On both sides, actually, as you just
on both sides too, but
to some
but
extent.
I'll put the onus on them because
Yeah.
if for example you had, I mean, let's be honest for a moment. If the Hamas laid down its arms, returned our hostages, said, you know what, we don't want to fight Israel anymore. Let's turn this region into something incredible. Israelis would jump at that opportunity. I mean, we've seen Israel do this time after time, right? Whether it was with Egypt, it was with Jordan, it was the constant, continuous attempts to reach peace with the Palestinians since the Oslo Accords of the 90s and with the Abraham Accords, of course. You know, I think that what we do need is definitely new leadership. What we also have to do more immediate is de-radicalize the Palestinian Authority and the whole Palestinian society, right? What we've kind of given a pass on that. We've allowed for textbooks to incite against us. We've allowed for their school system to call for our destruction, right? We've allowed for UNRWA to turn into what it is. And we're seeing now what exactly that United Nations agency has become. It's time for de-radicalization to become a big piece of this. And I think there's an opportunity, actually. I know that within the war cabinet, for example, there's a disagreement between some members who want to connect de-radicalization with reconstruction and other who say if there's not going to be de-radicalization, if we're not going to change the society, and it's going to take time, it's going to take years, but that's the path towards peace. Because if you can change the society and get rid and create another generation that of people who actually want to live in coexistence with you, then you can actually achieve amazing peace.
Right, but it's not only de-radicalization that needs to be done, it's also an anti-corruption drive. And also the instilling a basic level of administrative competence in the Palestinian Authority. And what you're talking about is creating something which doesn't exist in the region, really, which is a democratic Arab state that isn't corrupt, that isn't authoritarian, that doesn't incite against Jews, and that is competent and is sort of like a Western democracy in the Middle East, run by the people of that region. That doesn't exist anywhere else.
No, it doesn't exist. But why should Israel accept less than that, right? In other words, Israel should accept a state next to it that's run by an authoritarian leader with terrorist groups. I mean, what country would accept that reality? So if we really want sustainable peace, that's what we have to work towards. And that's why, again, tying back to what we spoke about before, I think the mistake of the Biden administration by trying to create this equivalency, for example, is you have an opportunity to use your pressure, your money, the huge amounts of aid that the British are giving, that the Americans are giving, that the Europeans are giving, to actually force and compel the Palestinian Authority to make these changes.
Right.
Abu Mazen is an example. His time has passed.
Right.
By the way, I think Netanyahu's time has passed too, right?
Yeah.
But Abu Mazen has to go. He was elected for a 4-year term almost 20 years ago.
Yeah.
We need a new leader who is able to actually work with Israel and understand that change is what's needed and is possible, and we can actually work together to achieve it.
But the thing is, I mean, I totally agree with you that Israel shouldn't settle for anything less and cannot settle for anything less if its security is to be guaranteed. But what I'm saying is that, you know, even Israel cannot create miracles in somebody else's prospective country with people who are not Israeli. You know, you cannot make something happen that cannot happen from its own side. And it strikes me that this drive towards the two-state solution that we've seen all sounds wonderful. As we've seen, like the end goal would be great normalization with the Saudis, you know, as a secure state, the end of Hamas, all the rest of it. But the missing piece of the puzzle is the Palestinians themselves. How can we find the people there? How can they find the people who can stand up and take on this responsibility?
You know, I don't control the Palestinian Authority, and Israel doesn't, and we can't force them to change in a way that they don't want to. But what we can do, and this would be, I can be critical of my own, and one of my big problems has long been that we Israelis have not decided what it is that we want, right? If, for example, we want to annex all of the Judea and Samaria, all of the West Bank, make it part of Israel, Netanyahu has the government to do that. He could pass a law tomorrow in the Knesset and annex the West Bank. If he wants to work towards this two-state solution because he understands that that is the objective, even if it's 25, 30 years from now, there are steps that we can take on the ground to start working towards that. By the way, that includes something very simple, talking to the other side, which we don't have today. So we don't, I'm not fond of Abu Mazen and the current Palestinian Authority, but they're fighting, they're against terrorism. They're not active in engaging and attacking Israel. They might speak out of two sides of their mouth, right?
Yeah.
With the laws and stuff, 100%. But the Palestinian Authority security forces are coordinating with Israel. There is room to grow and to build on, but we have to decide what it is that we want, and we don't, because instead we're bogged down by our politics. Right. We're not outlining a vision of what it is that we want. Remember, Zionism, Jake, was about Israel and the Jews seizing the decision-making process, deciding for themselves and determining their own fate. That's what we did here. We left the diaspora to establish a state here that's independent, that's our own, that we can determine what's going to happen to us. Why are we not doing that now? Why are we creating again a vacuum to get Biden to shove something down our throat, to get Sunak to shove something down our throat, or Schultz to shove something down our throat? It's up to us.
Right. And part of that is connected to the failure of Netanyahu's concept. You know, managing Hamas, managing Hezbollah. We know they want to kill us and they've got the resources to do so, but with our military edge, we can contain them. And in a way, that's defined Netanyahu's period in power, where he doesn't make any bold moves or decisions. He sort of manages things and keeps things quiet. And in a way, that's worked for Israelis. There's been a long period of peace under that sort of approach. But that came to an end on October the 7th, didn't it? But let's move on to talk a little bit, just before we finish, about Iran and Hezbollah, because there's been a lot of speculation about whether October the 7th was linked to the peace accords with the Arab states, and whether it was an attempt by Iran and obviously Hamas to derail that normalization process. Presumably, if this two-state drive shows any sign of bearing fruit, that may provoke Hezbollah to join the war, and actually Israel might have to take on Hezbollah anyway.
Hezbollah, this I call it the mini war. I mean, you know, people talk about how, like, is the third Lebanon war coming? We're in it right now, right? What's been happening since October 7th, daily attacks by Hezbollah with rockets, with anti-tank missiles, the fact that Israel has had to cede territory to Hezbollah essentially by creating a buffer zone inside our own territory goes against everything of our national security principles and doctrine.
And because something like 100,000 Israelis from the north have had to move down.
Correct. 100,000 have had to move out, and we've had to push people out of their towns and out of their homes, as opposed to creating this buffer zone in Lebanon, which is where it should. We don't have strategic depth in Israel, and I think you saw that on October 7th. The second they cross the border, they're inside our homes. Same thing applies to the north. Can we turn the tables on this? Of course, but that would probably mean a war. And the IDF in the Northern Command, and talking to IDF officers, they're preparing for that, right? That is something that is definitely possible. If the war winds down in the south, there's a hope that maybe Hezbollah will stop its attacks, but that doesn't mean that Hezbollah will leave the border. Mm-hmm. That's the problem. The problem is, how do you get 100,000 people to go back to their homes? And that is where the Europeans and the Americans and others, the French particularly, are trying to come up with some deal that sees Hezbollah move to the most famous river in the Middle East, called the Litani River. Everyone knows about this river, the Litani River. It's a small little stream, but it's about 20 kilometers north of the border with Israel. And if they only moved north of there, everything would be okay.
Because that's where they should be, according to the UN resolution at the end of the
1701. Correct. Yeah. From 2006, at the end of the Second Lebanon War, which they violated. We see how much they violated that today with the attacks they're launching against Israel. But again, even if they go north of the Litani River, A, they won't stay there. B, we're just kicking the can down the road. The ultimate clash between Israel and Hezbollah is unfortunately coming. And it's coming because you have, again, I think the lesson of October 7th is that you have this group that is there, that is bent on our destruction, that has amassed horrific numbers of rockets and missiles that cover and encompass the entire state of Israel. We shouldn't think that they're going to be engaged diplomatically or there's some way to contain them. That's the lesson of October 7th. It's not going to work.
Exactly. And actually, one reason why Hezbollah hasn't fully joined the war people are speculating is because Iran is keeping them in reserve, so that if Tehran gets attacked on its own soil because of it, with a strike on its nuclear program, for example, they will be able to unleash Hezbollah, and so they're sort of keeping that hanging over Israel. Which brings us to Tehran, which is behind all of this to some extent. How do you assess the American posture with regard to Iran over the past 4 years, and where do you think it's going to go next?
Very disappointing. I think that the Americans are making a tragic mistake that is going to haunt them for years to come. And I hate to use such harsh terms, and I hate to sound like some crazy neocon, but there is a war coming with Iran, whether we like it or not. Now, I think that it's possible to avoid that war. The way to do that is to present the Iranians with a credible military threat, for the Iranians to genuinely fear for their own survival. But instead of doing that, and let's look at the region just for a moment. Since October 7th, what's happened? Israel's fighting Hamas, an Iranian proxy. Israel's fighting Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy. Israel's getting attacked by the Houthis, an Iranian proxy. The Iranians are causing the most chaos and bloodshed in the world at the moment. And what's happening? They're getting away with murder and immunity. So if you are the Ayatollah or Raisi, the president, or the head of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, sitting somewhere in Tehran, by the way, Britain should be banning and not sanctioning, but outlawing or whatever it is, declaring a terrorist group.
Proscribing
the IRGC, which they have yet to do.
Yeah.
Put that aside. You are rubbing your hands in glee because your plan's working. Everybody's focused on Israel. Everybody's focused on the proxies, but not on you. That's a bad and dangerous lesson. Now, even what happened when Britain and the US attacked Yemen and Houthi targets, think of what that message sends. What does it show the world, or what does it show Iran? Is that you can use proxies, but only when it disrupts the shipping lanes, only when it hits the pocket, do the Americans and the Brits stand up and do something.
Right.
It's a bad message. And the Iranians, by the way, we see from the IAEA, they're accumulating more uranium enriched to over 60%. They're racing towards a nuclear weapon. They're lining up the ingredients and components that they will need for a fast breakout when they decide to do it. It's going to haunt us. Now, right. we can stop them without firing a single bomb or missile by just saying very clearly to the Ayatollahs, we're coming for you. We're not coming for the Houthis or Hezbollah or Hamas. It's you who's going to be in the crosshairs. And unfortunately, the Biden administration is not doing that. And I think that that's a huge mistake.
Right. I mean, this is the octopus doctrine that Naftali Bennett laid out when he was in power. And it's something that I've got great sympathy for. But from the Biden point of view, think about it, from what he's saying is that he doesn't want to risk an escalation of the conflict to draw Iran into an all-out war via an attack on Iranian soil, particularly when an election is just a few months away. Now, in my view, if you look at the precedent, whenever the Americans have gone hard against Iran, for example, when Trump authorized the killing of Qasem Soleimani in 2020, I believe, everyone talked about panicking about World War III and nothing meaningful came from the Iranians. They're all mouth, aren't they?
They're a paper tiger to a large extent. We've seen over the years. There's a lot of, threats and saber rattling and beating of the war drums, but they are weak and they are vulnerable. And it's about the world taking a tough stand and a strong stand. And I think that's the opportunity that, by the way, it's the opportunity that October 7th presents us with, that what was can no longer be. Us in Israel, I think we pretty much understand that. And that's the change that we are working to achieve to create a new security reality in Gaza and hopefully on the border with Lebanon. But it has to be bigger. And it's an opportunity for the world to take advantage of this also and to say, Iran, we're going to put you in your place. We're going to hold you accountable. It's no longer a game of proxies. It's going to include also your nuclear program. I mean, imagine for a moment that the Biden, who's now contemplating what exactly, but we're speaking before we've seen the American retaliation to the killing of those 3 soldiers by an Iraqi militia proxy of Iran in a drone attack in Jordan a few days ago. And the president has said he knows what he's going to do. He's prepared the response. We don't yet know what it's going to include. Imagine if he attacks Iran and he sends a clear message to the Iranians. No more. Stop. You are vulnerable. That sends a message that I think will resonate for a long time here in the Middle East.
Right. And that could easily be done because it seems like America has forgotten that the American economy dwarfs the Iranian economy. The American armed forces dwarfs the Iranian armed forces. And that's before you even take into account America's allies, such as, most importantly, Israel, of course. But one person who has not forgotten that power imbalance in our favor is Donald Trump. And this is the man who may be once again in the White House in just a few short months' time. Do you think that would be a good thing?
You want to get me in trouble here. I don't know. Look, Trump comes with a whole bag of problems of his own, and who knows what type of Trump is going to come into the White House. Israelis tend to think, oh, he's great for us, but you don't know that. And, a Trump who's basically without any restrictions and doesn't have to get reelected is a Trump who could do whatever he wants and could just write off Israel and say, I don't even care about you. You're more of a headache than an ally. So I think we do have to tread carefully. On the other hand, I'll tell you what I hear from people within his vicinity and Republican officials who are very close to the president, who have told me that if he was president, now things would look different. Again, take that with a grain of salt. I do not know. But the proof will be in what happens. But you mentioned Qasem Soleimani. I think that was an impressive moment by President Trump, where he decided to remove that terrible actor from this earth and try to send that message to the Iranians, but also put them on call or on standby that they are in the crosshairs. And that's important to get that message again across to the Iranians.
Right, and based on his previous track record in the Middle East with regard to pulling out of the Iranian nuclear deal, the support for Israel, the deal of the century didn't happen, let's face it, but the killing of Qasem Soleimani, that would suggest that maybe if he came in, it wouldn't be such a bad thing, at least for the Middle East, maybe.
Maybe a big maybe, because again, you don't know what's going to happen. I think that even Netanyahu, when he thinks about at night while he's lying in bed, after he thinks about his trial and after he thinks about his political trouble, and he thinks about who do I want really, Trump or Biden? Biden at least is a known commodity, is an actor that you kind of can predict and work with within boundaries and understand where things are going. Trump is not that stable. And
Right.
that could be, you upset him in a way, it gets very personal. You don't know what he's going to do. And I think you have to be careful with exactly how that plays out.
Right, like the madman doctrine is handy when it comes to your enemies, but it makes it a little bit difficult to be an ally. Well, Yaakov,
Well
thank you
said.
so much for your time today. I always like speaking to you because not only do we look alike, but we also agree on many things, and it's always a pleasure to speak to somebody who agrees with you. So thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you soon, either here or in Israel.
Thank you very much, Jake. It was great to be with you in the Jewish Chronicle.